This week on the show, we are delighted and hugely excited to be joined by photographer extraordinaire Emily Maye, who joins us from New York City. Now, Emily is predominantly known for her sports photography, but she's also fast becoming known, if not already very well known, as a director as well. Has just done an amazing campaign, which I'm sure we'll start talking about at some point. But we kind of want to start, Emily, by saying, firstly, thank you for giving up your time and coming on the show. And secondly, give us a little bit of background. Like, what was your journey into photography? Because your work is something that I've followed for, I don't know, I was trying to look back at when we first got in touch, but it was probably 6-7 years ago.
So a long time ago now.
I've been kind of watching your work from afar with much kind of excitement and envy at times, and just awe, I guess is a good way to put it, because the stuff you do is amazing, and you've really carved a niche out for yourself. But I'm sure your beginnings were very humble, like a lot of people in this industry. So let's start with that. How did you get into photography?
I've pretty much been into photography my whole life. If you look on my Instagram, there's a video of me at like 6 or 7 years old or something, taking a picture of my brother on film, and he's holding a football, and I'm like arranging him into a portrait position. He's like 4 years old, like with my dad, and telling him to like stand backlit and like turn this way and get closer together. And I take the picture, and I move my body with the prime lens to like figure out my framing at this very young age. Wow. And I do this little step that is like exactly what I do now. And it's funny when people see the video, they're like, it's 100% what you do. Completely now. So in some ways, it's been a part of my life for a long time. And I grew up in ballet. My mom was a professional ballet dancer. And I grew up in her ballet school. And I think, that early training teaches you about line and proportion and space and geometry, all those things that do affect storytelling without words, right? They all are things that affect how I photograph and what interests me about sports and about the human body and about how the body can tell stories, like fatigue or excitement or any anticipation, all of those things that feel kind of hard to describe. I think ballet training taught me how to photograph those, how to make those come to life in an interesting way. So photography was something that even, 13 or 14, I would take photography classes and stuff, but it was an area that I just experimented with and had fun with. It was not, I wanted to be a ballet dancer or I wanted to be a movie director. And those are the only things I've ever wanted to do. And photography was like something I experimented with and had fun with. And I didn't take it so seriously, where I took these other two things incredibly seriously. And then somehow it became this tool that I had that was really fun and that I had a really positive relationship to, because I had allowed it to develop with a sense of play and experimentation, and had just such a positive reaction to every part of the process, to editing photos, taking planning shoots, any of that stuff. And it became the career that I pursued more full-time at a certain point.
And so did you study photography or did you study something else?
So I did cinema. So I went to film school at USC. I started taking cinema classes when I was about 13, 14 at the university when I was still in high school, and founded the film club in my high school and worked for the film festival in town. I grew up in California, in Santa Barbara, and then went to USC film school. I decided that it wasn't the place for me. I felt so specialized at such a young age, and I had seen so many of the movies that we were studying in film school already. And so I thought, man, what am I going to make movies about? It doesn't feel like I should be studying other movies at 18 years old. I should be trying to figure out what I'm going to make them about. I'd already kind of done that part of the process. So I decided to leave USC and I went to Columbia in New York. And there I thought, okay, I'm going to do ancient political philosophy and Russian history, and I'm gonna all these other pursuits. Wow. And I ended up taking a screenwriting class, and I had not written before. I had not really exercised that part of the process, and it just brought me right back in. And so I ended up looking at screenwriting more and graduating with a screenwriting emphasis through there. So.
Would you say then, I mean, that's really interesting as a journey into photography. Would you say that your early influences were more cinema than they were photographers?
Still are, early and to this day. I mean, I think that is where the influence comes from. And I think it really is what inspired even my journey into being a professional photographer. I was writing a screenplay, and I was going to go take pictures for the mood board for that script as a procrastination tool, to not have to write. And those photos that I took, people ended up seeing early on and sort of offering me more opportunities. Like I sold, it was like a cycling script. And so I went and took some cycling pictures for that mood board, and sold one of those pictures to a magazine. And then I decided, I need more. Like, I don't feel like I fully accomplished what I was trying to do. I'm going to go back. I'm going to shoot another race. And then there I met a couple people, and the opportunity arose to be embedded with the Bontrager Trek team for their season at the time, like early development days. When you look at that, the roster of riders that were part of that team at that time, like all of them are world tour riders now. And it was kind of a really fun heyday of that team. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. Like, it's research. Like, I'll understand the inner workings more. That's like a great procrastination tool. I'll go do that. And, I think it was all a testament to the fact that photography was a tool I could use professionally. Like, I knew what I was doing enough to be able to offer that, but it wasn't something that I was like, I'm going to go be a photographer. I was inquisitive about how to tell the story of that, and to take that opportunity and tell the story of what it was like to be inside of that team and what races were like. And all of that was sort of with a cinematic eye, because in my mind, it all related back to a film and to a project that captured that in a more cinematic way. And so I think you see that relationship in like the photos from early on, that that's what it's looking to do. And that was like where my eye came from.
Mm-hmm. And if you did have to kind of say what your photographic influences were, has that stayed the same? Has that changed? Do you enjoy, I mean, it's just fascinating because obviously the two mediums are very similar in the sense that they're telling stories visually, but the way of telling them, I mean, photography and cinema, they do go hand in hand in so many ways, but at the same time, there's something so different about the still image versus the moving image, apart from the obvious. And so I wonder, what would you say your photographic influences were?
Yeah, I would say at the time it was like, those Robert Capa Tour de France pictures and things like that. I was like, oh, this is, that documentary photography tradition that you feel like, okay, that captures what I want to capture. I would say now I'm more interested in like a more Americana like style of photographic influence now. But I think the thing that makes them, they're so different. And as I've explored both mediums more, you really start to learn that there's so little overlap between them. Like, I might have been influenced by color or character that comes from movies, but a photograph you're asked to look at for longer than the moment happens inherently, right? There's no way that you could look at it for the brief amount of time that the second is captured. You're always going to look at it longer. And it's so different to work in moving image where you're, at the same time or slowed down or any of that. You rarely are, you're in sync with it in that way. And so it's just completely different, and I don't think I thought about that power in the moment. And as I fell in love with photography as a career, that was the thing overwhelmingly that just really made me see its power. Was like, it seems so simple to say, but freezing time and then looking at it for longer than it exists is incredible power.
I've always seen it as almost like a permission to stare.
Yeah.
Because people, you're always told as a kid, like, it's rude to stare, but that's what kids naturally do when they see something and they're fascinated by it. And we're just, as humans, we're not allowed to do it. But photography kind of gives us permission to actually stare at things. And that's quite rare. And it's also quite special because it then gives you time to really consider what you're looking at. And that's where, for me, like you said, that's where the power lies with photography, is that ability to actually slow down and appreciate a scene and all the nuances that come from that, which day-to-day life, there's just no time to consider.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you're like going through the process of selecting images, which is super, super important to do instinctually to me to
Yeah.
try to not fight what it is that draws me to one picture over another in a sequence, and allow that to happen as a really like emotional response to it, and very quickly. But then also to be willing to cut out pictures that don't feel like they're quite right. I think you have to learn that ability to do that. And what you learn in that process is like, okay, why is this picture better than this picture? And it's usually because you want to stare at it longer, because it has more information in it. It doesn't feel like as throwaway, you know? And at a time now where everybody swipes through really, really quickly and stuff, you know, it's, I try to spend as much time like looking at things for as long as I can in that space, and going to galleries or looking at books. And I'm sure like you guys, I collect photo books and have them around my house and stuff. And then sometimes I go like, man, I looked at this like once when I bought it, and try to actually set aside time to like go back and look at those books and spend the time with it and stuff. And, you know, I ultimately spent more time with the Pro Tour team after that, and moved up to that team and spent a couple years inside of that team. And I remember watching somebody flick through the gallery that I had done on their phone, and it was like so fast. And it was like, I just remember being like, man, that was such a hard day. Like the weather was so hard. And like, I was really proud of those pictures, but it was like, you know, you're like, man, it's just so fast. Like someone just absorbs it, you know, and it's so depressing.
Do they absorb it though?
No, I mean, they like don't. Yeah, I guess like it's so fast that they just like, they like absorb it and throw it away, I guess, or whatever. And as a unit, you know. So. But
it's that emotional connection that you're talking about, which is so fascinating. When you can tell that that's the way you edit your work, because your work really, the pictures work on an emotional level. Yeah. There's something about them. And you see sometimes like complicated compositions and stuff, sometimes they shouldn't work, but there's just something about them that the connection just, it stops you in your tracks for a split second. And as you said, when you're looking at work like that, you can pick up on that quite quickly, and that becomes instinct, and that's the same reaction that caused you to take that picture in the first place. And
100%,
that's very much comes across in your work, is that's how you work
over time, right? I've had a fairly long career at this point in terms of it's been, you know, I think like 14 years or something that I've been doing this full time, 12 years, something like that. And as you start to build a body of work over time, I've tried to protect that process and trust that process, and not overthink it, and try to value the fact that that is my contribution to the process in a lot of ways. Like I can take as many pictures as I want, but that feeling that I feel when I'm pulling them down and sort of saying this picture is the one, that's my contribution, and I shouldn't overthink it, and I shouldn't fight it. Like that's essentially what is me in there. And it's interesting over time, as you have a career, to then look at the body of work that you pull into your portfolio and things like that. And you have a picture from 10 years ago, and you have a picture from last week, and you have a picture from all these different places. And if it feels like there's some cohesion in the work that I'm doing, which is not like studio work that's been completely, you know, a vision from start to finish, it is more responsive out in the real world. What is that unifying thing as you start to put the portfolio together? And whatever that thing is like what I am as a photographer. And so it's a strange process.
I mean, I find that fascinating in the sense of, how do you find it on set then when you're dealing with, because obviously with commercial shoots that can be a balancing act. I've certainly found myself, because I guess my style of shooting is quite similar to yours in the sense it's more reportage observed, and not every photographer is going to be working in that way. Some photographers are very much, you know, they build a frame by frame until they kind of have their final composition rather than instinctually reacting to stuff. So then on commercial shoots, it can be a bit tricky if you're then working with a team where they want to kind of build and add things, and there's like a certain thing, oh, actually, can we just have that turned slightly this way? And then it's very easy for it to lose that spontaneity, which is what you've been hired to shoot in the first place, or that style of shooting. Yeah. How do you find yourself kind of dealing with that?
There's a couple points to that too that I think are important factors in that. I think it's a huge issue, right? It's a huge concern as it's this sort of, for me, it started as this very like private thing where I didn't have any influence of anyone telling me what to shoot. And so I had a lot of freedom early on, and I was able to react as I saw fit. And then you get bigger and bigger commercial jobs. And then, as you said, the obstacle is like having a lot of people on set, even like just there's a lot of people around. And it took me a long time to be comfortable with that and say like, well, everybody there has their own job to do, and I can actually just like stay in my head and do my job. And I try to think, okay, how can I bounce between the request and the requirement of what I'm being asked to do, and then stay open to the person that I'm shooting and something that they might bring to it that that they do. It's a lot like when you're directing and trying to look at dialogue and someone says something and it's like, oh, wait, say it like that again. Like, do that again. You did that and you changed it, but that had a rhythm to it that felt like yours or something, and being open to that process versus, super, super scripted. And I think the same is true of trying to fracture your mind a little bit to a more commercial project that's like, a request from our director to change something or to move somebody a certain way or do something. But then who's the person that you're photographing, and are you ready for if they do something that might be that X factor that you're looking for? And so I think staying open to that, being really present, and the other hard part is that as you move into bigger and bigger commercial jobs, and this is certainly true of directing, where I think that's amplified even more, you're the leader of the set. You're the leader of the, you have to decide, what are we doing next? So, I want this lens, I want that, or you have a team of people working for you, you're giving instructions, you're looking at a monitor. It's so different than, shoots that you and I have had where you're the only one looking at the back of the screen, and, you're making all the decisions. You don't have to run them by anybody. There's no second checkpoint. So how do you keep switching your brain between being a leader, communicating, having discussions with clients, and then being open to spontaneous moments that might arise, or putting the talent, taking that note and putting it through your filter of what's a process that's going to lead that person to have something a little bit more come out of them than just applying the note. You can't take the note literally, because that will be dead on arrival. So what's the process of filtering through your experience, how you can instruct talent to do something that still leaves room for a beautiful moment that you wouldn't expect in a way.
It's interesting talking about kind of getting in the right headspace for shoots and stuff, because obviously that is also quite similar for a lot of your subjects, I imagine. When you're photographing athletes, pre-race and what have you, people really need to get in the zone. And, as a photographer kind of floating around that, you become acutely aware of it, because you want to kind of just leave them to be in their space, but at the same time, those are kind of interesting pictures. Do you have any techniques that you've picked up from sports stars and athletes over time to kind of get your head in the game and to be focused? Have you developed any ways of, do you do any meditation, or do you do any kind of other forms of running yourself just to kind of get your mindset in the right space?
No, I think I'm really interested in who they actually are. And, it kind of ranges in terms of the level of commercial output that you're being asked to get from them. And I think the biggest thing to recognize is that athletes are not models and actors. They're not super comfortable with that process. Some of them are. Some of them have just a great chemistry, a great sense of camera. And sometimes those are the less interesting people to photograph, to be honest, because they come with a personality and a approach that it's harder to get something different than what they've decided they're going to be on camera. And I'm more interested in not taking that, more interested in what they haven't been on camera before. And so it really is about understanding them and talking to them as a real person, disarming them in that way, and just being okay, what's your process? What can we bring to this that's personal to you? Or giving them the freedom. I like to be really prepared to move around very easily around them, so that it's not okay, can you do this thing, that you wouldn't normally do in this exact corner, because that's where we've lit it. I think that's when things start to get really rigid. It's kind of okay, how can I respond to, give them an action, but let them find the place that they're more comfortable doing that in a way, if that makes sense. Even if it's just totally slightly over, it's just what do they do? Being ready, lighting and things like that, or how to use natural light in a way that works with the process they already have, so that they're comfortable. They feel like it's not asking them to do something uncomfortable, because they immediately tense up.
Yeah, well, I mean, just purely from a logistics point of view, a lot of what you're doing is having to, if you're shooting cycling or running, is keeping up with these people. And do you find yourself doing that, from the backs of cars, from the backs of bikes? Have you kind of got weird I'm trying to think what's the word I'm looking for? Rigs that you've kind of set up, or are you just go with the flow? Because I imagine it's changed since your early days, where it was very much, on the fly, to obviously doing it commercially is going to be much more legit.
Yeah, and
but
different
we've all been on those shoots
with moving
where
image. Yeah. It's a challenge. I mean, you want to be able to, for me, I want to be as naturally as possible with them, so I find that I like to find, like, in an ideal setup, right? There's a lot of different setups, but in an ideal setup, I want to be able to hold the camera or have the DP holding the camera and being able to move with them in a way that they can find a natural relationship to that. And it's different more in moving image and directing commercials. I think there's a little bit more room for rigs that move a certain way and stuff, but there's something about it that always feels like weird. If you have too much ability to put the camera anywhere, it's like, especially if you look at it as a set, it just kind of feels like there wasn't, it's almost like having a zoom lens in a way, right? You're just like, oh, there's like all these different perspectives or something, rather than a person who moved their perspective in relationship to the body. And so I try to keep it as natural as possible. I shoot from cars. I've shot from, back of motorbike and stuff when I did cycling, and shot from like, bike rigs, rickshaw type things. It all depends on the speed that you need to keep up with that movement. Is very different, for different things.
Of course.
I shot the U.S. water polo team for ESPN one time and spent some time with them. And that was interesting because you're dealing with, I wish I could go back and do it again, but you're dealing with above water and below water, and you're dealing with a pool. So you're moving around this thing, but you just feel like you're, at a zoo, like looking in on something. You can't like get it from the inside out. Like, I feel like I would love to do that better and to understand it better and be like, what are the tools that you need? And how can I like those pictures a lot for what they are, but I think about it often actually of like, that was one of the more challenging ones of like a pool is so tricky because you have like these edges that you're kind of attached to unless you're,
Well, so much of water polo as well is the kind of dynamic stuff that happens under the water. And you very rarely see that. Yeah, exactly.
As an audience member, you don't see it though either. And so in a way, it feels unnatural to have that point of view. So you're trying to decide like, what's the perspective? Am I the perspective of the players and what they experience? Is that like what I'm trying to show people? Or am I trying to show this sport like, and what people like about it when they watch it? Like, that's a very different point of view. So trying to determine what the point of view for something like that is and what experience you're trying to convey is interesting when you have this like half of it that you can't see,
Well, I think maybe they've just been doing water polo wrong and they should be playing it in a big fish tank, because it's quite entertaining to watch.
Give us the whole perspective. That would be so wild if they like intercut the like cameras, like like they like went to just, I mean, I think they do maybe sometimes show like some underwater, but it'd be funny if it was just like, what if they like flipped it entirely and you're just only the underwater camera for the whole game and you have to like intuit what happened,
Yeah, that'd be fascinating. So you're when you kind of were shooting, obviously you started to transition a few years ago to shooting more film, which by the sounds of it was always kind of part of your plan.
Yeah.
Especially being it's such an early influence for you. How did that kind of, I mean, this was one of my questions, but having heard your kind of backstory, it now is less relevant because it sounds like it was something that you were always kind of going to do. And I imagine that actually when you did your first directing roles, it probably felt quite natural to you. Whereas for a lot of photographers, that transition can be very different.
Absolutely. And I remember the first commercial that I directed, I went to the executive producer and I was like, this is awesome. It's just giving your opinion all the time. It is kind of different than photographing in that way. Like and you do on days and days of prep and then commercials, you get this like decision fatigue that I've never experienced as a photographer. Where you have to answer so many questions about, do you want this or do you want this? Do you want this or do you want and everything, like every take is like, I like that. Let's go again. Let's do this. Like you're just constantly saying what you like and what you don't like. And I just remember feeling like, oh yeah, I found my calling.
I guess though, as a photographer, those kind of conversations they're had internally, and then you say, I would like, as opposed to the full team coming to you.
Yes,
and then kind of getting asked those questions.
And it's interesting how exhausting that process is when because with directing too, it's self-initiated, right? You're trying to, like, not everyone's coming to you. You're also initiating, like, I want to do this, and then and let's set it up this way, and let's have this or whatever. But you do have to articulate it to other people. And that takes a lot more effort because you're going to have a conversation's going to come out of it as well, or something is going to come out of it. And I think when you have those conversations in your head, it's easier to like shorthand it with yourself. Like you're not actually articulating it in a way that uses energy or requires you to actually think it through. And I think when I first started directing, I would say something and then I would change my mind. And that was like, oh, you can't do that, and I had to learn in a way to think it through, bring the process more mentally first, and then say what I wanted with like more confidence that I can stick to it. But I was more like reactive and then would be like, actually, let's do this. And it just annoys people a lot. And, I've like gotten so much better at that. I think it's one of the things I've gotten a lot better at is not doing that anymore. But to answer your question about the transition, yeah, it was like the thing I wanted all along. But I wasn't pursuing it. It was not something that I was doing. Like I had switched over to photography entirely for 8 years, had, photo reps, was completely in that world and doing commercial photography. And in my mind, there was a certain point where I was like, maybe I'm not a screenwriter anymore. I haven't written anything in like 5 years. Like, am I still just like on an extended break from the screenwriting? Is that still what what I do? How do I think of myself? And I'd sort of begun to think of myself as a photographer first and foremost, but I was not pursuing directing. And I think it was that point that a lot of photographers, it became photographer director on all of the rosters for all of the photography agents, and everybody was being pushed into coupling both of them. And I was aware of that as like a trend that was happening, but also I hold it on such high esteem that I knew I didn't want to do it that way, that was not what I was seeking. So it was in the back of my mind. And I got approached by a production company in California via Instagram that was like, we see your work everywhere. And have you ever thought about directing? And I was like, my whole life, that's all I've thought about. Like, and we had a conversation. I went out there and I met with them, and I had not done anything. I didn't have anything on my reel at that point, but they could tell through the conversation that it was like something I had clearly thought about. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I don't even know what that means. I knew what it meant and I knew how I wanted to do it. And so I made that decision to sign with a production company as a director and to keep my photography representation entirely separate. And I'm one of the few people that did that way and still does it that way. Most people couple them together, and I've kept them entirely separate, completely separate paths. And I don't do, like if it's stills on my directing set, it has to be separate time, and I change hats completely. And I do that. So it's not a DP that's capturing stuff and then that's going on my directing portfolio. If I'm directing, you have my full brain and that's what I'm doing. And if I'm shooting stills, that's what I'm doing. And so I'll take work in either of the places at this point. And if I'm engaged for one or the other, but I keep it separate entirely. And that's really, really different than how other people do it.
Yeah, but it's also really refreshing to hear, because there's so much pressure on photographers to kind of be like, basically we want double the amount of work in half the time type thing, and we want to get, more bang for our buck, so can you wear all these different hats?
And kind of like, can you be a brand that's offering all these services, right? Or like, can you be like, that's what the ask is in a lot of ways. And so you're having to outsource that and say, yeah, I can be that. I can hire people that execute all of that. And it's also a question with second shooters, all that stuff. Like what's the protocol for all of those things? And I would say, it allowed me to keep a visual style that actually felt more mine in that transition, because it was my brain doing the directing and doing the work. It was my instincts, and it's my the things that move me and things that I want to see and participate in. And so it is almost more cohesive because it isn't like outsourced. Like, obviously I work with DPs and I work with a team of people, and you learn how to communicate your vision. But it's not something that I'm not really directing. Like I see the monitor, I know what's on there. Versus I think when you're shooting stills and someone's DPing and you're not watching that, and then you just see the edit, you have no idea how to make a film what you want it to be, you know? And that was, I think, the fear of like, if you go down that route and an editor makes a great edit out of something, and then you're asked to repeat that, which is what the whole industry is have you already done this? Can you do it again? You don't know how. You didn't participate in it, you know? You weren't there for the directing of it. So I didn't want that.
Right.
And do you, just to go back to kind of when you were shooting stills, you talked earlier about kind of, you know, if you use Zoom, you've kind of got all of these choices to make in framing in terms. Have you found yourself naturally kind of being somebody who shoots more with a kind of a simplified paired back system? Do you kind of just say shoot, you know, because for a lot of my career, I kind of would say 35, 50 mil, 2 cameras, you know, those lenses stay on and then you can cover most things with that.
Yeah.
Have you found that approach is something that you'd taken naturally, or have you...
I don't.
Switched a lot, gone through a lot of systems and different ways of working?
I have tried every camera, every setup, always in search of like the...
Music for Tom's ears.
I was going to say, kindred spirits, you and I.
I'll show up on a set and people will be like, you know, wait, you're all Sony now? Like entirely? Like what? Like, and then it'll be, wait, you're all like Nikon now? Like what's going on? You know? And I'll switch all the time and I'll just go through phases and I shoot a lot on a zoom lens because it's most practical in sports work to have the ability. I would say I land on very similar parts of that lens in a way. You know, you have the tool, but I wouldn't say that I don't have decision paralysis about that process anymore. I've been doing it long enough that I think when you're starting out or and you're working that way, I do think it's always better to start in like more of a prime situation where you're moving yourself and you're understanding framing a little bit more. I mean, I've done this long enough now to like know where, when I'm bringing the camera up, like where it's going anyways, you know? And so it's not a process I think about anymore. And the zooms make it certainly easier when you're out doing that. And I still really like the process with photography of managing that myself and, you know, changing lenses myself and making all those decisions. And to me, that's really refreshing to like have that ability to like be alone in that process. I really like that. So yeah, Zoom like helps with that for sure. But it's funny, I'm back on Canon now and like, that's what I started on. And
like Tom.
We've had very, very similar gear journeys. So you're on the R5? You're on the R5?
Yeah, I'm on the R5 and it was funny because, you know, I think when I was shooting cycling and I was in hotels like 300 days a year and like I shot so much in those few years that I was with the pro cycling team and I shot on Canon at that time. And so it was something where you get those skills too of like delivering the photos that night and being able to put up a gallery the next day. So I had all those systems of how I, you know, modify all the buttons to be able to like star things in camera and all this stuff that I do to it. And I've tried with every other system that I've gone to replicate, I guess, that process because it's the process that I had. And then when I just switched to the R5, it was like, oh, all the buttons like are exactly where like I had learned all that muscle memory. And so that was very satisfying to be like, I'm home. Like I've come back home. Like this is what I grew up on and like what I'm used to. But it's still not perfect. There's no perfect gear. It's impossible.
There's no perfect gear, right? Yeah. Like there's always because I've had a similar thing, but I kind of ended up buying phase ones and all sorts. It got very silly over here for a minute. But there's no
done all
perfect
that. I got the Fuji medium format. It's probably my favorite actually to shoot on.
Hang on. Did you buy a Hasselblad as well?
No, I kind of avoided the Hasselblad, but it's like the only one I avoided.
Did you do Leica?
Yeah, I did, and I did the M10 with no screen. For a little bit.
Yes,
like,
I had the MD262. Hey, this is wild. I wonder if we did it at the same time in the same order.
We're just like,
did you use the Leica SL system as well?
I did not. No.
Okay,
no,
so I've got one up on you there.
Yeah.
So I went Fuji to the Leica and then Leica to Sony to Canon.
Yeah.
Because isn't it? It's so frustrating though, isn't it? Because almost all of them are fantastic systems.
Yeah.
But there's always just something
Yeah, I think I'm
Yeah.
over it now, to be honest. Like I feel
Same.
Yeah, I feel like okay, like it's not out there, you know, it's not really gonna I would say the Fuji medium format is the closest that I feel while I'm shooting it to like the experience that I'm looking for. It's not super practical for a lot of the sports work that I do, but I recently did a personal project in Alaska, and I hadn't done a personal project for photography in like 9 years.
Is that the baseball?
Yeah.
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 Love
It turns out I'm a terrible client. Like, oh my gosh, like it's awful. But that I shot mostly on that, and it was like, okay, yeah, this is like the experience I think I look for and stuff. But yeah, I'm sick of the trial and error. I'm sick of believing that there's a system that I will be like, yep, this like it's just
There's
good.
peace though. There's peace in realizing that there is not such thing as camera perfection.
No, there's
and actually,
not.
you just kind of go, cool. Okay, well, listen, I've got the best that's right for me, and I will move on.
Yeah, and I think you romanticize like certain versions of previous cameras. You know, it's in my mind, like the Canon 5D Mark II was like the perfect camera, and I'm sure if I shot it now, I'd be like, no, you know. But I don't know. It was like at the time, it just felt so perfect, or it felt like it was the closest
nostalgia.
There. Yeah,
nostalgia. It's a hell of a force.
Yeah, but so what happened with the pandemic was I have this apartment in New York, I have the apartment in California, and I was heading to California to shoot for Tracksmith. There's this race, the Speed Project, that they participated in a few years earlier, and they were going to do again. And you run from Santa Monica Pier to Las Vegas, welcome sign in a relay race. And so that happens in March, and I was headed out to California to shoot that. And I was like, I have this Sony system. I never use it. I never take it on jobs. I'm going to take it out for Speed Project. It seems like a perfect time to like shoot that and try it. And yeah, I'm just going to take that. I'm not going to take any other kit, and it'll be perfect. I'll be back here in 2 weeks and, you know, switch it back up or whatever. And so I think we all know where that goes. But I ended up staying in California, you know, for the entire pandemic. And I didn't come back to New York. I had to call my brother and say, can you throw stuff out of the fridge? You know, I don't think I'm coming back. And it was, I had so a year and a half, you know, I shot on the Sony, like unexpectedly. And I had to keep like buying buy a second body for it or whatever. And I think that helped me get over that trial thing in some ways. Like it was the first step of getting over it, of the fact that like I hated that camera at some point so much. And I was just like, this doesn't, mostly because it's just not rugged enough. Like all the knobs were breaking off on the top and stuff. Like it's not rugged enough for how much I throw camera equipment around. And I had to live with it, and I just had to shoot with it. And like the files are great, they're beautiful, you know. And you're just like, it doesn't really matter. This is what I'm doing, you know. This is what I have to do. And then I remember coming back to New York a year and a half later and shooting with the D850 that had been sitting here, that had been like my go-to camera, and going back to an optical viewfinder and being like, wow, I've gotten so lazy. That is, wow, I really have gotten lazy, you know. So that difference too is a big one of, you know, I think that's the biggest one, is what's the electronic viewfinders versus optical, of course.
I got to say, I can't do optical anymore.
Yeah.
I just can't.
No.
The level of detailed data info that you get now, and the IAF, I'm through and through mirrorless. I have been for years, never going back.
So I shoot film for all of my personal work, and I for like everything in my life, I shoot film. Like every day I have a point and shoot with me. I try to take pictures. I try to have it in my pocket every single day. And if I see something, a sign that's funny, or the light looks interesting on this, or that old building is cool, or, you know, my friend or whatever, I shoot it all the time. And so I feel like I still have, like, that's point and shoot, but then it's like I shoot on the M6 as well, and like I shoot all film for my personal life. So I feel like I still have like a balance of the two, but I think it's nice, like the data overload, it kind of affects your decisions about exposure before you've engaged your brain. Obviously, like we know that's all of what can happen with it. And I find when you spend a little bit of time, like you have that muscle memory of going back to optical. If you spend just a little bit of time with it, and then you look at the pictures that you create, like not just like take a few, but like spend 2 weeks shooting optical again, and then look at the pictures that you take, and you'll find that your exposure is actually very different, I think. And you just make really different decisions. And so, I don't know, I've kind of played around with that a little bit to just remind myself, like, stop to make decisions and not really try, like, the electronic viewfinders are really good. Like you can, of course, if you've knocked some buttons and you put it to your eye and you're like, oh, okay, something's off. Like that's really nice, you know, if you're in a rush, but still trying to keep your brain engaged on what you're doing.
Do you think with the exposure, so this is something that I see a lot of people in forums, I run a tech consultancy on the side, I get a lot of questions about this as well. Do you think with the exposure simulation that you have on the mirrorless in the viewfinder, plus also the kind of the contrast effect when you're going bright outside to looking at a very small screen in the viewfinder, people are getting tricked into just trusting the exposure they see in the viewfinder, no longer using histograms, they're just kind of guessing that tiny little monitor in the viewfinder is the correct one?
Yes, absolutely.
So I've worked through loads of different ways of doing this to the point where I now have masking tape and tape over all my TTL pins. And so I'm now able on the R5 to get exposure simulation on demand using the depth of field whilst using a flash trigger by doing all of that. But I kind of feel like we shouldn't have to do but they're going back to our previous conversation, no cameras are perfect and stuff like that. So I actually now don't have exposure simulation. I don't trust it at all. Sorry. So I shoot to the iPad or the laptop all the time.
Yeah. And
if I don't, I'm going back to my old school when I used to shoot bands 15 years ago, and I used to use a little Zacuto Z-Finder loop on the back screen. And so now I use that to gauge the exposure now instead. Remember those? Yeah. So I'm using that now instead because I just feel that the exposure simulation and the little viewfinder, I'm totally with you. The exposures are all over the shop.
And like, what's your process? You know, everyone's process is totally different in terms of processing the photos. And so I think, you know, I find I'm like always pulling down that exposure, like, you know, and so you just try to work with that. And, you know, I don't know, it's super tricky. I also really love, I know, like Greg, I remember you shooting like Fuji at one point that I was also shooting like in my Fuji phase with like the smaller ones, you know, and I had to, I saw like I don't know, there's so many numbers and letters with all of these, but like the Pro 3 or whatever that has the screen that you cannot look at it. I love that. Like I love the cameras that you can do that. And I do that with that's how I shoot the R5. Like I always have it flipped back.
But what's so interesting, you know, I think, with the way that digital, to go to shooting, you know, your film cameras versus your digital, it is a different experience, the actual shooting, because you've got less stuff between you and the subject. Yeah. There isn't all of this electronic data. There's just more of a kind of feeling. There's more of a kind of connection perhaps with the person that you're shooting, because you're not kind of being distracted by all of this stuff. And there's also something quite strange about having an literal electronic barrier between you and the subject, rather than just looking through a viewfinder that's optical, or, you know, whether it be an SLR or a kind of a Rolleiflex or something like that. But do you kind of find as well when you're then editing that work, because obviously on your website you have this snap section where you upload a lot of your film 35mm film stuff, do you find that when you're editing film work, that is also different because you've got less to choose from? I mean,
totally.
The thing with shooting sports, you must shoot loads at some events, and
and you kind of leave it with what it is. I mean, I think the imperfections of film are like the entire point, you know. I think that's like the fun, you know, that you're so much less critical about what that turns out like, and it just gives you a feeling right away. You're like, it feels like something, and you know.
I'm sure you probably get hired as well at times, and by people saying we love this and referencing the film work. Yeah. And that's always interesting when you get hired because somebody's seen, you know, something you've shot on film and it does have imperfections and it's got that kind of, and then they want to recreate that again on a commercial level.
It looks better. It just looks better. Film just looks better. Let's just all agree it looks better, you know. I'm always trying to shoot like I've done motion picture work on film as well, and I'm always trying to push that where I can, and it just looks better, and it holds motion differently on moving image, you know, in ways that are really beautiful. But I think part of what happens with the electronic viewfinders in terms of your process is your brain is analyzing the computer screen of what you're seeing, and it's analyzing the exposure essentially that you're being given. And so like you're analyzing that with your brain, and it takes you out of the moment in a way that when you go back to shooting optical or even just the point and shoot, it's like, it's spontaneous. It's all about just like, oh, I see that, I'm going to frame it up, I'm going to take a picture of it. And that we trusted our settings in optical more. Like we were like, okay, we know what we're doing. We've got settings. We're making choices based on what you're seeing in real life and how you might like overexpose for that because it's a little more like shooting directly into the sun or, you know, something that you might do. But when you have the information on the electronic, you're analyzing, that's what you're looking at a computer screen, you know, you're not looking at the thing, you're looking at the finished product. And so it doesn't, it takes you out of it, you know?
It's so funny you mention that. So I have found exactly that. And I'm now finding myself getting everything set. And then I'm kind of finding myself like come away from the camera, like the eye autofocus, I know it's going to be in focus, right? Like because I don't know if you see my work, but it's all portraits and I just know it'll be in focus. Yeah. So now to get that connection back, I'm kind of bringing myself away from the camera only by like an inch or two, or I'm setting the camera on a tripod and then bringing myself completely away from it. Yeah. So yeah, it's
I find
funny,
I look at the back of the screen flipped down. Like I always thought like people were so weird that would like look down at like the screen and shoot with the screen. And I almost always do that instead of bringing it to my eye, to be honest, because with that, I'm at least like, I'll look down and I'll look up and I'll have the real life and I'll have this pathway to do that versus moving, obviously like moving your camera or like, you know, going around that way doesn't really work as well. So I find I shoot on the screen all the time now, you know, and I think that's where the R5 screen is an absolute nightmare. When you have that thing tethered, you gotta like have the cables the right way to wield it. Like there's so many things about it that are a total nightmare. But that was surprising to me that that's become such a big part of my process, you know.
Getting back to kind of, you know, what you shoot rather than how you shoot. What would you say are your favorite things to shoot? What draws you? What excites you? What kind of projects naturally feel like they compel you towards them?
I would say people, and people that are performers by nature. Like they have even if they don't know that, like they're not aware of that there's something in them that wants to, not that they want to be on a stage with sport, but that they like the moment of like performance that has to happen when you have to like bring your best to something, that they like that, right? They like the level of competition. Like that's what I mean by a performer. Not that they're like, oh, I just like being on the stage, like doesn't matter what I do, but they invite this like moment in themselves that they have to do something more. They have to perform and they have to
They're
like
high
rally.
Performers.
Yeah, right. You know, and I think part of that maybe comes from like my ballet background and the idea that like, you know, you practice and you do all this and then there's a moment of like stage time and what's your preparation before you go on stage and, you know, how do you put yourself in the right headspace and, you know, you want to have all your rituals and everything that's like perfect. And I love those aspects of people that like that moment, that they invite that moment. And, you know, we can talk about Kobe Bryant as the person who maybe epitomizes that in a way for me, but it's like something like that is where you have that moment that, that someone is going to rise to an occasion and put themselves on the line. And that's really what it is, right? Is they're putting their desire for something on the line. And that's incredibly romantic to me, that you're willing to do that and that you're willing to say, I want this, I'm going to go for it, and might not get it. You know, I think we all look at that and go, I want to be someone that's willing to do that. Like that feels brave, and it feels like, or you believe in your work that you've put in, or you know, you're the underdog and you don't stand a chance, but you're still there. Like any of those storylines that sports have, to me, are very compelling, and it's about the person and it's about their relationship to that, like first and foremost. And then I would say the other thing I really love to shoot is something I haven't shot before. It's always really exciting. You know, I love to come in with a fresh eye and quite nerdy and love to like find all the details in something. And so if I can come into a place I haven't seen before and look around, right, and roam around and see it and understand what it's unfolding and how I respond to it naturally. That's always a really exciting moment. I think it's harder when you've done something over and over to be like, how do I do this in a fresh way, or and sometimes you push through that. Sometimes the fact that it's so familiar reinvigorates your eye to like look at it different ways, because you go past almost a boredom back into like looking at it freshly. So but yeah.
How do you go about forcing, because sometimes you do need to kind of not force the inspiration, but sometimes you need to kind of get yourself into the right headspace to be excited about something, in order to be kind of like, right, I'm actually now pumped about shooting this because I've started to think it through. For me, I might look at photo books or something and kind of just spend a morning doing that with a cup of coffee and kind of going, oh, I love this and love that, and you start to get inspired again. But I feel like for a lot of people, we're surrounded by visual media, on our phones, to the point where it almost is like overload, and you just kind of, we've had a couple of people here on the podcast before, and we discussed the idea of the visual diet, the idea that you're constantly consuming visual media, but what are you consuming? Are you consuming loads of TikTok videos that are kind of a certain quality? And is that then going to affect the way that you visualize the world or you try and represent the world? And it's almost like, how do you kind of detox and bring it back to your vision? Do you have any kind of techniques or things that you've had to do to try and do that in the past?
I'm fueled entirely by coffee and caffeine, and that just gets me through in every moment. It just keeps me inspired at all times. I think what you say is really true, and I think one of the things that's tough about the way that we see visuals all the time because of Instagram. I spend way too much time on Instagram. I'm guilty of all of those things. Not on TikTok, because I just know like it will be like my brain will die. But it comes at you. And I wouldn't say that that's actually like the same thing as receiving like something that inspires you or creativity. Like some things cut through, and I have a process for saving things that inspire me and putting those back out there. And I do mood boards on my Instagram where I go through those sort of saves and I post them for other people. And, it's been I used to never do anything like that, like anything personal. The same thing is true with like the point and shoot, like the snaps. I didn't put any of that stuff out there because it felt too casual to me as I was like building my career. But I think now, as I'm more established, what it shows people is more of like my personality, my interests, and I can be seen as like entirely sports driven or sports focused in terms of my work. And that's not who I am as a person. And so being able to show people like I have a lot more to me than that. And also I'm pulling like influences from a lot of different places. I think that's where you start to make original, interesting work, is when you're inspired by something that seemingly has no connection, but because it moves you and filters through you in a way that like creates that like excitement, and then you apply it in a way to something else. That's what creates new work, and that makes things keep evolving. So what I do now is I create space and time for actually looking for inspiration rather than passively receive. I passively receive it all the time as it's coming at me on Instagram, but that's not the same thing. So I do try to spend like an hour a week. I carve out like really specific time where, like I said, I'm either looking through photo books or I'm pulling and organizing references for myself so that I have those tools organized so that I can look at them when I'm looking for inspiration. I know what I like. And so I want to exercise that part of my brain that goes, I like this, I like this, I like this, I like this. And it's different than when I have to write a treatment and pull reference images or something that's towards a specific task. That's a different thing than just being like, I'm just Emily. I like all these things. And what happens is you start to see how unrelated those likes are. And that's what makes up your emotional response to creative. And like, how do you then distill that into something that feels like you, so I actually create time for it. And that's something that I've done in the past year and a half or so. And I would say even the point and shoot work and that stuff is me creating time and space for that, to even have my eye say, I like the light there, or this moment looks like interesting. It's not meant to be like art. I'm not doing that. It's just like my eye going like, okay, like dopamine response of like, I like this in the real world. I'm going to take a picture of it. versus I like this on a digital world, I'm going to save it all the time. Like, you gotta,
I think it's massively overlooked by a lot of jobbing photographers, you know, in the sense that actually you do have to feed that creativity and put time aside to, it kind of almost feels a bit indulgent, especially when we get carried away with to-do lists and, you know, getting the accounts in order and doing this and doing that. You know, there's always jobs to be done, but they're not necessarily, they're kind of almost forms of procrastination.
Yeah.
Because the actual difficult thing is knuckling down and doing the kind of writing the damn book. You know, it's that thing of sitting down and doing the work. And that, I think lots of photographers that I speak to don't necessarily have that discipline. And this isn't a criticism, because I've certainly done the same, you know, like of actually going, no, I do have to sit down and feed that. I have to feed.
And it's fun. It shouldn't feel like work. It's more like, I take that from like a really casual perspective. It's not like, okay, go be inspired because you have to do this as a photographer. This is what like photographers do. I'm always like intrigued by the photographers that always have a camera with them and like are always creating work. Like, I was never that person. It was like, that's job time. And I've tried to like move more towards that of like, if you have a camera with you, you'll see more things and you'll exercise that part in a more casual way that won't feel like work. But in terms of the collecting of inspiration, it should be just fun. And you should feel like, okay, I'm going to set that aside. Like, I don't have to make anything based on that inspiration. I don't have to do anything. I absorbed it without, if you're on your phone and you're doing it, you can also get a text message. You can also get, like, you're not really seeing it, right? You're doing 5 things at once. And if you're scrolling, the next thing you see is not even related to that. So if you're like, okay,
no, it immediately takes you away from what you last looked at.
You're not
you
developing
can't even remember
that concentration, you know, in any way.
Yeah.
But then set it aside, like let it go. You'll be surprised how much it creeps into your thinking when you have a problem to solve. You just kind of think like, what you're trying to do is understand that there's a bigger world of possibilities of how to answer questions of what you can do creatively. And so it just gives you more tools for that, you know?
Also, taking a little bit of time out for yourself to have a nice coffee and do something like that. It sounds like the dream. Like Greg says, most jobbing photographers don't do it. And I'm here going, yeah, I am absolutely guaranteed that I don't do that. And I really should. But the trouble is also, because there's no instant payoff for it, it's like a long-term thing, isn't it? Because you might be inspired by it down the line, like a year or so, a month or so, whatever. But, you know, if I need to send my accountants my info or whatever, that's a tangible task that I've got to do.
Yeah. So
I'm going to try and schedule some time. So you do it an hour a week.
I mean, like, do 15 minutes. I think the thing is like don't. What you should do is, like, if there's a book in your house that you haven't looked at, sit down and look at that. There's a lot. It may make you pick up another one and look at another one.
Not the phone book, Tom. Not the phone book.
And an hour may go by. That's the thing. It's like, you don't have to be like, okay, like setting a timer for an hour or whatever. I often find that if you create the tiniest bit of space for like that, like interacting with something with your full concentration, you're probably going to want to stay in that headspace because it feels really good. So you're just like, okay, I want to look at another one.
I bet. Do you know what though? So I've got, I don't know, you can't see because we're shooting in thin format. I've got 40 books up there.
Yeah.
And I've my big thing this year is minimalism. So this year I've started off and I've been watching lots of YouTubes about it. And then I was like, oh, hang on a minute. Why am I watching all this stuff? I've got loads of books in the office. I wonder how many are about minimalism. Yeah. Ironically, almost all of them.
Yeah.
I genuinely, I couldn't believe it. I kind of came out to my wife this morning. I was just like, oh, look, I've got this book on minimalism. She goes, yeah, you bought that years ago. You've not read it? And I was like, no. And I've not read any of the others about minimalism either.
Yeah.
So it's, but yeah, what I'm going to start doing, not going to put a time on it, but I'm a slow coffee drinker.
Yeah.
So if I can just sit until I've finished, I'm going to give that a go.
Yeah. I mean, I think all the other things the tasks that you have, the emails, the things that you have to like send, all that stuff, it expands or shrinks into the amount of time that you have, to be honest. Like, you will go through it faster if you have less time for it. Like, you'll get it done. Like, if you've ever, not checked your email for 5 hours and then you go back, you're like, wow, I got through those emails in like 4 minutes and archived it, like whatever. It was so much quicker than all day, like refreshing, and how much that takes you out of things. So I mean, I'm guilty of all that, but like I try to practice that a little bit more. I watch films really intentionally, and I spend a lot of time watching movies, and that's just a practice that I've had, you know, my whole life. But I do also try to do that in less of, in more of a pointed way, and less of like, what do I feel like watching today? Like yesterday, I watched 2 films that were like experimental biopics, right? And it was interesting to watch both of them together that were really, really different ways to approach a biopic, you know? And so how do you use that as a theme and say, okay, I'm going to like look for other films that follow this theme? Or I like to do that with movies because I've seen a lot of movies, and it would be very hard to just scroll through Netflix or something and be like, what do I feel like watching today? And I love movies. I feel like anything, you know? So how do I make that a little bit more pointed towards something that I might take something from? You know, but then sometimes I just watch like a TV show, you know, it's like not like, it doesn't all have to be like, you know, it sounds very schoolish, you know,
right? But doesn't it? Sit down. This is what you have to watch.
But at the same point, I think you stop being a student of these things as you get older in a way that, I don't know. I don't want to stop doing that. Like I want to keep being getting better and expanding how my mind makes connections. Cause I'm stronger at doing that than I was as, you know, an 18-year-old or 22-year-old. So, yeah, push myself, I guess, to make deeper connections to those types of inspirations.
Nice.
Well, listen, I think we've kept you for quite a long time.
Sorry.
So I think we should probably start to, even though I've got like loads more questions that I could carry on. But we at this point in the show, we always ask our guests the 2 questions that finalise the show, which are your desert island camera and your desert island photo book. Now, obviously, we've discussed bits about the camera. I'm excited to hear this.
No camera on the desert island. I'm just kidding.
I kind of want to know what's in your film camera collection, because I'm a nerd.
I would say the Contax T3 would be my desert island camera. I love the Contax T3. But I have so many. Yeah, I have so many cameras, but I would choose that. I would choose the point and shoot film camera as long as we've got film. Yeah, that would be my.
What's your kind of go-to? Do you shoot much medium format film or?
I have dabbled with it here and there, and I used the Pentax 6.7 for a while. That's probably like the greatest camera ever made. I think it's just so huge and impractical to carry with you anywhere. You know, it's the size of my head, and you know the sound it makes when you take a photo on that camera is just like, it makes me giggle, because it's like the idea that a photo takes some of your soul, you know, takes some like a piece of somebody's soul. The sound of that camera, you're like, oh yeah, I see where they got that from. Like it sounds like it does. Like it is.
It's taken the soul of everyone on set.
It crunched something out and like, you know, biopsied it. Yeah. But I love that camera. But I don't use it. I don't think I have a version 1, but not the version 2 anymore. And the version 2 is so much better.
They break very easily from what I've heard.
Yeah, they're quite fragile.
The Contax T3, I have the T2, which is a 35mm. Is the T3 a zoom lens?
No, it's fixed 30. It's 35. Where I think the T2 is 38. Right? I think it's like a 38mm lens.
Maybe,
it's like a little bit.
God,
it's a little bit different.
That's why my framing's been off.
It's a little bit different. But I have one of those as well, and I've got a good collection of the point and shoot cameras, and try to take care of that. I like the G2 as well. I love all those Contax film cameras.
Contax
really
G2,
great.
which is more of a rangefinder, right? It's kind of interchangeable lens.
Yeah, but still like autofocus. You really have to look at where it's drawing the autofocus. Like you've got to check the metering with the T3 as well. Like you've just got to be on like what it's saying, because it can be tricky, can be off.
What do you tend to shoot film stock wise?
I usually shoot like 400 just in general, so I'm kind of switch between portrait and I like that weird Lomo 400 with like stock. I like that.
I've not
I
tried
shoot a
that.
lot of that. I would say like almost all of my point and shoot snaps are like that film stock. So I do like that.
Okay.
I've been shooting some Kodak Gold lately. There's a company, Midwest Film Co. in the States that respools cinema film with the remjet still on it and stuff. So I've gotten some of that recently, and so I'm gonna give that a little try. But I haven't shot. They just DX coded it so that you can put it in the point and shoots and stuff. So I'm excited to give that a try coming up. And then
does that have to go back to them for processing?
there's a couple lab, like you could take, it doesn't have to, you could take it to a lab that can then process the ECN2, but
okay,
they do that, if you know, but there's very few that do. So
sure.
but
That's cool. That's cool though.
I've been carrying a Super 8 camera with me and trying to figure out what that means for me and how that is like gonna, like, what do I want out of that? So
is it to look like an extra in a Wes Anderson film?
Yeah, it's like, it's small and it's portable. I like the idea of doing it. I haven't found my rhythm with like
how
what
small
I
are we
want.
talking?
Like it's like this big. Like it fits. Like I have like
yeah, small.
No, that looks in perspective. I think for bigger, but it's like the size of a book, you know. So
okay.
I mean, I think like a paperback book. I mean, you can keep it with you. I think that I'm just trying to figure out what I want to do with it and what that means. Like, because I have this process now of shooting just snaps essentially, and like I want it to be like that, but moving. But then what do I want to do with it? And it's just reminded me that they're two totally different mediums and they shouldn't like have the same process, you know? And so
because you don't really get snaps in moving image, right? Because there's always normally something more to show.
Yeah, like,
but there's the idea of having those little vignettes. I kind of see where you're coming from.
I know.
With it. But how many minutes do you get on a roll?
3.5.
8. Okay,
yeah. If you're shooting at 18 frames, I have a camera that shoots at 24, so it's less if you want to do that. But yeah, so I haven't figured out. It's expensive to develop. Yeah. You know, I just haven't figured out if that's part of my process or not. I took the train across the U.S. twice last year, like full cross country train journeys. For fun and
the Blue Zephyr or whatever it's called, or
California
like that,
Zephyr. I did that, and I did the Sunset Limited from New Orleans to Los Angeles as well. And you know, that's something I want to do more of, but I felt like, you know, that's where I wished I had something like that. I shot a lot of like phone video and stuff, but I don't know. We'll see. I'm not sure if that's going to make an appearance or how it's going to evolve or what it's going to be. I sort of have an idea of where it's going, but it's been a fun little experiment. So like I just always experimenting with different cameras and hating them, and you know, it's like it's my next, like I hadn't gone that route yet. So I'm like, do I need a 16mm film camera? Is that what I need? And then so you understand, Tom.
Oh, nice.
Oh, so much.
He's furiously googling 8mm cameras in the background on eBay now. What's your desert island photo book?
So I'm going to go the Eddie Merckx 525 book, just to keep it in my cycling theme. It's not necessarily a photography book, but it's a beautiful, beautiful cycling book. I really love that. The images from that are something that I look at frequently that I really, really love. And it's, chronicles his whole career. And so
I used to have a really beautiful Eddie Merckx road bike.
Yeah.
God, it got me in all sorts of trouble, road accidents and whatever, and I think it eventually got nicked. But I've there's something quite beautiful and special and very romantic about that old period of the Tour de France as well, isn't there? It's
Amazing.
just something quite. Yeah. I don't know if it's weird, isn't it, when you look back at old athletes and the way that the whole concept back then, you know, even with like the racing drivers, you look at kind of James Hunt, who's a British Formula One driver, in the way that they would get absolutely bladdered and partying the night before a massive race, or like, you know, the Tour de France, and they're stopping, and rather than getting water, they're all grabbing beers and running back out and getting on their bikes. And it's just kind of like, it's just a different era.
I think sport and life were more happening together at the same point in a way. Now that, you know, it's a career, and you know, there's liability contracts, sponsorship deals, things that, I don't know, that like change just like all that.
It's almost like the rock and roll element.
The
rock and roll element of it maybe slightly disappeared.
And it was like
kind of in the way it did with rock and roll.
Exactly. You know, now everybody's vegan and nobody drinks, and you know, that's good. Like, everyone could be healthy, but it does like ruin rock and roll a little bit. That recklessness, right? And I think that like the feeling that you get, you know, cycling is dangerous. It's reckless, you know? I mean, it's a sport where you're really, every day that you go out, you're comfortable with the fact that you might crash, you might break bones that day. Like, that would not be unheard of by any means. And, you know, I don't...
Well, also, they're not small crashes, are they? People have died, and it's really serious.
It's super serious.
But even training, I mean, you can
Oh, 100%,
you know, just going out, if you're training on the roads every day, I mean, your chances of being hit go through the roof.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think that just reminds you that like the people that do it they really love it. Like they can't not do it in a way. And there's an intensity there that even to this day, I think it still has, and it's really beautiful. And that's something I really respond to in that sport, that I think that still exists. And it's even when someone kind of has the attitude of like it's a job and they like clock in or like they do the thing, it's still really beautiful because it feels very sacrificial and it's just got a lot to it. But I think there, early days there was that recklessness. I mean, that era photo book, I mean, they're not wearing helmets or anything. It's crazy. Yeah. It's like so beautiful. But I think it was a different feeling there. But it's a very beautiful all black and white photos. But very distilled.
Well, we'll put a link up if we can find a copy online. We'll put a link up for people. Obviously, if people want to see more of your work, you've done this amazing campaign that's recently just launched. Like I think either was it last week or. I mean, it's kind of irrelevant because when this goes out, it'll be different. Yeah, so it launched around, so it was the week of Christmas, and then Christmas Day was sort of where it all culminated. And Kobe had played a lot of Christmas Day episodes. Yeah, so it's a campaign of films around Kobe Bryant and famous moments from Kobe's life, imagined through young people today that are embodying both the moment in their own way and also the pillars of what it means to be Mamba and have Mamba mentality. And so I grew up, in Southern California as a Lakers fan and a Kobe fan first and foremost. And so incredible opportunity to be able to contribute to his legacy and to just channel the inspiration that I take in my own life from him and be able to put that out there and see that in film form. And they're really beautifully restrained. They put storytelling first and they let the moment sit there. Some of them are single shot, no cuts and things like that. And so beautiful, beautiful campaign from Wieden and Kennedy and Nike. And I'm so happy to be a part of it. Yeah. Amazing. And there's a wonderful quote that you put up that I kind of think is right relevant to what we've been chatting about it was a Kobe Bryant quote, which was, I think the definition of greatness is to inspire the people next to you. I think that's what greatness is or should be. It's not something that lives and dies with one person. It's how you inspire a person to then inspire another person, that then inspires another person. That's how you create something that I think lasts forever. That's our challenge as people, to figure out how our story can impact others and motivate them in a way to create their own greatness, which I thought was kind of chimes really well with a lot of what you've been saying. So, thanks. Yeah, super. I think inspiring. It's been a real pleasure to have you on. I mean, please do check out Emily's work. She's on Instagram at Emily Maye, which is Maye is spelled Maye. But obviously, if you're following us on Instagram, you'll see the posts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, all the links will be below. So, Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure to have you on. Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the show. If you would like to find out more, you can find us on YouTube, which is just youtube.com @expose negative, and we are @xnegative on Instagram. And if you'd like to follow us personally, you can find myself there as @GregFennell, which is GregFunnell, and Tom can be found as tombarnes.com, which is TomBarnesDotcom. Thanks very much.